In emergencies, emergency officials' decisions are influenced by their mental and emotional health. These decisions also affect the mental and emotional health of the communities that they serve. We'll talk with an emergency management professional who also knows quite a bit about how the brain functions. Up next on this episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast.
From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. As workplace mental health has become a global priority, there's a greater focus on addressing psychosocial hazards. Each episode, we look at psychological safety from an occupational health and safety perspective. Let's talk Psych Health and Safety.
Welcome to this week's Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. I'm your host, Dr. I. David Daniels, and I want to thank you for tuning in. Each week, we seek to increase awareness of the importance of psychological health and safety by learning from the lived experience, research, and expertise of our guests, as well as advocating strategies to reduce harm and minimize vulnerability to psychosocial hazards in the American workplace. Since its inception in 2004, National Preparedness Month has been observed each September in the United States. It's sponsored by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, within the Department of Homeland Security, and it encourages Americans to prepare for emergencies in their communities. When faced with an emergency, we often make what are described as split-second decisions. Still, the basis of our decisions tend to be our lived experiences, not only in similar situations, but in dissimilar ones as well. The split-second decision can have a lasting effect on not only those impacted by the incident, emergency, or disaster, but on the person who makes the decision itself. Sometimes these decisions can set up a lifetime of mental and emotional challenges for all that are involved. So in this episode, I have the pleasure of speaking with someone who knows a little bit about emergency management and a little bit about how the brain works. As a matter of fact, knows a lot about both. And it's an honor to be able to have this conversation to get some expertise in both of these topics. So we're going to dive right in, and let's start with an introduction from our guest, by our guest, with this question. Who is Deb Needham?
Hi, David. That's a good question, and that is not always an easy answer for me, but I think if I had to sum it up, I would say I'm a crisis management professional with a systems thinking spin and a lot of dabbling in neuroscience. My background is that I have had a lot of jobs over my life, but in the last almost 25 years, I've been a professional emergency manager. I have my roots. My first career was as a paramedic, and I've had a lot of road in between. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from. And so that's basically who I am.
Okay. Well, we're going to dive right into it. And interesting that you mentioned your background or your foundations as a paramedic, because it starts to connect. I think sometimes people separate emergency related things into these different silos, and I see them all as connected safety related activities. They really are, because we do need systems when people can't figure out how to, to prevent, to prepare, to mitigate. If they can't do all those things to ensure that disasters and emergencies don't happen, then we have to have systems to take care of it after the fact. That's just the way it is. And that's the way the world works. But before we dive in there, what does psychological health and safety mean to you when you hear that phrase? What does that mean to you?
So what pops into my mind, first of all, is I have a strong commitment to and the courage to be authentic. And yet I find that if I'm in places where I can't bring my authentic self there, that doesn't feel safe to me. So for me, part of psychological safety is being able to be authentic, be who I am, bring my whole self to work. I think the other part of it for me is feeling like I fit or feeling like I belong, like I have a place. I don't have to be the same as everybody else, and I definitely don't want to be the same as everybody else, but I need to feel like I fit and I need to feel that I belong. So I would say for me, the two biggest things in that are authenticity and belonging.
Yeah, the belonging piece really is important because so there's a book out there called Four Stages of Psychological Safety, and Dr. Uh, Clark, the author of the book, suggests that there are these four stages. And the first stage is inclusion. And there are a lot of stages, spaces, places where I know personally I felt included, but I didn't really feel like I belonged. So you get the invitation to show up, but then when you get there, kind of really, not really. We just invited you, but we really didn't expect you to really do anything. We just kind of wanted you in the room for the picture,
Mm-hmm.
or for the so we can say that we talked to you, but it really didn't feel like a belonging kind of thing. So we'll sure we'll get to dive into that as well. So share a little bit about how Deb Needham ends up interested in emergency management. How does that happen?
Well, I think it goes all the way back to childhood. I know this, maybe some people think that's going too far back, but I grew up, my dad's a bit of a survivalist. And so I grew up part of my childhood was spent in a log cabin in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And we had to make do on our own. I remember chopping wood at 5 a.m. in the snow in my bare feet and getting the wood stove kindled up and getting it going because we heated exclusively with wood heat. I just remember feeling like that feeling of you just have to take care of yourself. I also didn't have an easy childhood. There were some difficult emotional aspects to my childhood, and so I grew up always having to manage what felt like emotional crises that I was caught in. And I became the go-to person. I learned how to do it really well because I am very resilient, and I learned how to do it so well that my nickname became Dr. Debbie. I don't like to be called Debbie, just so we know. But I was constantly, if someone got hurt, they came and got me, and I could handle it because I had learned how to stay calm and keep myself together during what was unsettling for other people. So in childhood, I developed this locus in my life of crisis, but being able to manage it and being able to step in and out of it and seeming to be unruffled by it. And so as I became an adult, when I was a young adult, my first real career was as a paramedic. And I also learned even more how to manage stress. You see some really awful things in the field as a paramedic, and I learned how to manage that. And I also learned how to help other people be calm in that. And when I transitioned to working into emergency management, I found that now I'm doing the same thing, but I'm helping people at a community-wide level rather than just on an individual one-on-one emergency. So, and I have a side business called Crisis Optimist. And I decided that name came to me. I was recovering from foot surgery, and that name came to me. I was trying to think about, what is the theme of my life? What is it? What is the core of what I do? And I came up with this name, Crisis Optimist, and that's when I started my business. So I do consulting and work with other people, often around organizational issues that are a crisis level. But it's the same thing. I like bringing that sense of, I can handle this, helping other people feel that too.
Hmm.
So that's kind of what got me into it.
Right. So you can handle it. Other people can handle it too. So talk a little bit about how we see these things, these emergencies, these disasters, because even though the names themselves are relative, one person's incident is somebody else's disaster, depending on all kinds of things, their life experience, how they're feeling at the time, so on. So talk a little bit about how, again, when you looked at the very same situations as a paramedic or as an emergency or as an emergency manager, and what you see is a set of, things to be dealt with, and other people look at it as the end of their life. I mean, talk a little bit about that perceptual difference.
Sure. And I think to be fair, there is a difference with people who do that sort of thing professionally. It's going to come easier to them simply because they're doing it through repetition and they're constantly rehearsing. They're in that mode of what if all the time. So part of how that works, though, is that the brain, if I can do a little brain science here, if I may, the way the brain works when you encounter some kind of an emergency or a sense of threat, whatever that might be, what the brain does is it triggers the part of the brain called the amygdala. And the amygdala gives you that instant surge where you are in fight or flight mode, or you may freeze. But the intent is to help you survive. It's to put you into emergency mode, like DEFCON, whatever. And so that way you're focused only on the emergency and on mitigating the threat and getting yourself to safety. Well, when that happens, what happens is that blood flow comes away from the prefrontal cortex, which is where you have your decision-making capabilities, and it moves to the amygdala, which is more in the base and the middle of the brain. And so when that happens, you lose the ability to do complex cognitive functions, and instead you're just getting all the energy to survival. So what happens in amygdala trigger is you go back to what you know. This is why it's so important to have people practice fire drills, for instance, to know what to do, to take classes in first aid or whatever, because you get that muscle memory and you start building it into your repertoire of what are your automatic responses. And so when that happens, you're going to go on autopilot, but because you've drilled it and learned it over and over again, that becomes your emergency go-to of how you respond. Super important, because one of the things that the amygdala does is it eliminates your ability to be flexible and creative in complex situations. It focuses on the simplicity around survival. So when you've drilled and learned something, it wants to put you back in a box and do very basic stuff. And so when you've drilled and drilled something, that's going to be part of your repertoire that your amygdala can access. And so it can become the instant reaction that you have. So I think that's the hard part, is how do you overcome when you're in a state of threat from the amygdala firing off. The trick is, how do you get yourself out of what's called amygdala hijack and get yourself into being able to reactivate your prefrontal cortex so you have more cognitive resources available to help you manage something that's more complicated than just a hot stove, for instance, when you jump back from a hot stove.
This discussion is a really interesting connection to the definition of psychosocial hazards that I developed in my research. So a psychosocial hazard is a psychosocial factor that's perceived or experienced by the person as a threat that in turn affects their behavior. And it's that perception or experience, and it's different for every single solitary human being on the planet. It's totally, and it can be different in different circumstances and environments. My perception or my experience of threat, and what makes it a psychosocial hazard is that perception then affects how I behave. And the behaviors can lead me to all kinds of other things. I may react in ways that the group doesn't appreciate or like or accept. I may do things that'll ultimately maybe even cause me physical injury, but it's because of that perception. The reason why I did it. So the reason that I yelled at the person in front of me, the whole road rage thing. We're driving down the road and there's a perception of threat. So that person in their finery, their jewelry and their suit or whatever it is, all of a sudden becomes very emotional. It has this emotional outburst. It's because of the perception of threat. And I just think that's such an important connection. And so what I hear you saying is it's a primal way we were designed kind of thing, because my amygdala fired up and boom, I react in a certain way.
Yes. And I think there's some universal triggers which we can predict. And so I really am a fan of Dr. David Rock has done some work around neuroleadership. I don't know if he's the only founder, but he's a co-founder for sure of the Neuroleadership Institute. They have a podcast every Friday. It's very, very interesting stuff. But one of his pieces of work that I first encountered when I did my master's research on this was the SCARF model. And he says that there are 5 things that are universal human triggers that will put people into a state of threat. One of them is status. So status can be something like when you hear like some random thing where there's this shooting and they ask the perpetrator, why did you shoot him? And he says, he disrespected me. That's a status. That's a status thing. The person felt on some way they'd been put down, and that's a status thing. So status is one thing. Another thing would be certainty. And we see that in every single emergency or disaster that's there is this ambiguity around how's it going to turn out? What's going to happen next? So there's always uncertainty there. So when you don't have certainty, that puts people into a state of threat. This is also true in organizations. That's why communication is so important in organizations, because that helps give some certainty to what's going on in an organizational change. And then there's autonomy. Anytime you take away people's ability to control their own destiny, you start putting people into a state of threat when they're feeling controlled. This is one of my worst triggers for me, is micromanagement. I hate it. And it's a trigger because it hits my autonomy button. Another one is relatedness. And when people are concerned about whether or not they belong, or whether or not they've fractured a relationship, that's going to be very upsetting for people. And so that puts them into a state of threat. So here we start getting into really social stuff. It's not like snakes across the path. This is like social. And the other one is fairness. It doesn't even have to be fairness that's affecting you personally, but when you see unfairness happening in the world, that puts us all in a state of threat. I think that's happening globally and socially. We're all seeing a lot of unfairness and inequity. That triggers that state of threat for people even who witness it. So when you're in those triggers, you have to remain aware that you're having them. And so I think the number one thing that I think really helps people mitigate amygdala hijack is simply learning to cultivate a practice of self-awareness. So when those things happen, those triggers fire, you're like, oh, Deb could go, that's my autonomy button getting stepped on. Right. And I recognize that I see it. And so at least I have the awareness of what I'm dealing with. Now I can take measures to start getting myself out of that hijacked state.
Right. Right. Wow. This is, again, such a, and I appreciate you bringing up Dr. Rock's work because you're recently I've just started to hear more about it, and I'm certainly not as adept at it as you are, but it's just a very interesting connection to the whole conversation about psychosocial hazards. Again, a perception, an experience that triggers a belief that I'm being threatened. And again, the psycho, how you think, social is how you act. That's, and it really seems like there's a connection to his work around these, what you're describing as universal triggers. And the way I see that is most people are going to react to one of those 5 things. May not be, all 5 of them, but the average person is probably going to be triggered if you push one of those 5 buttons.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And when we start talking about how that affects organizations, so, my view around psychosocial hazard mitigation is, instead of trying to change the person, it's pay attention to the environment that the person is in and the triggers that exist, the things that go on that could potentially trigger the person. And again, I can, even as I'm saying this, I hear the voices in my ear that would say, well, we don't really have time to stop and worry about how everybody feels. Well, actually, yeah, you do. Yeah, you do. You do. The question is whether you're going to take the time and whether or not it's important. And I realize that the person at the top of the organization, the CEO, the director, the leader, the chief, the whatever their name is, it may be difficult to spend time paying attention to how everybody feels, but you could start with the people that are around you. Because the people that are around you, if they're feeling triggered, what's going to happen? Of course, they're going to go trigger other people who are going to trigger other people, and it kind of cascades down through the organization or through the group. And so it does, like many safety related things, it just start with leadership. But I just love that, starting to understand that connection. So what about people who are repeatedly triggered? I think that this, some people even think it's an epidemic of stress and burnout in the workplace has something to do with, again, the weakness of the human being. And I don't know. I think, again, going back to your point, could it be this repeated triggering? Does that cause people does that get you closer to burnout?
I think with repeated, well, first of all, let me just say, a lot of people, I think, misuse the word trigger. And so when I'm using the word triggered, I am talking about the amygdala has been activated, and you can physiologically, you can prove that blood flow, if you had them in an MRI and you purposely triggered somebody in an MRI, I don't know why you would do that, but if you did, you would actually see the blood flow move in the brain. I think sometimes people use the word trigger to say there's something I don't like. And I think there's a difference. So I think that first of all, sometimes people overuse that word trigger, and I think it's perfectly valid to say there's something you don't like, but whether it's really thrown them into a state of threat, I think sometimes that's not true. Sometimes they're just not liking what they're seeing, and that becomes a conversation and a need to deal with conflict management and be able to have some healthy confrontation skills for behaviors. But when somebody really is repeatedly triggered, for instance, a person of color who is being repeatedly subjected to microaggressions, that would be an excellent example. In that case, what happens is it builds to a point where it becomes cumulative stress and cumulative threat. The weight of it is greater than having an isolated incident. So when you have something that happens repeatedly over and over and over again, and it's hitting one of your triggers, that is going to create a weight that is much greater than if you just had it happen one time. Because one time your brain can explain away, but when it happens over and over again, you begin to believe that's the way it always is going to be. And then that same person, even though the other person may not have had any negative intent whatsoever, they're going to be constantly on edge. And like you were talking about, the perception of it, the brain knows nothing except what it perceives. So perception is everything to the person who's experiencing the trigger or experiencing the stress. And so I think to your point, the environment needing to work the environment as well, we have to recognize that no matter how good our intentions are, we may have unintended impacts on other people. And so we can't know what that is unless we ask. And likewise, sometimes if someone doesn't ask, then that person who's been triggered needs to have a good way to be able to say, that's not okay, and this is the effect it's having on me. And so I think we need some more skills around conversation and bringing those things up. But I think that difference between an intent and an impact, they're completely different. And sometimes people just simply can't get that extra perspective to be able to see, why do I need to change my behavior? If that's happening in the person's head, isn't it their problem? And the fact is, it isn't their problem. It's a we problem, because we have to interact.
Right. I love that point. It's not this or that. It is this and that. It's both. And paying attention. So when I hear people talk about the concept of psychological safety, or this belief that we can be in a team environment and express ourselves, be ourselves, and not worry about, retaliation and that type of thing. What I think gets missed is that puts a lot of, sometimes the responsibility is all on the person. What's going on with you? So let's build resiliency with you. Let's help you be, but not a lot of attention to the environment we put the person in. We just don't. It's like, you're the problem. Well, no, it is both. It is both the environment and it's the person, and it's how those two things, and to your point about whether or not it's a trigger or not, it's frequency, severity, and duration of exposure to the hazard, and how those things kind of intermix for the person that start to determine whether or not they end up in this state of, I can tell you that there are certain environments, now having had the number of birthdays that I've had, that I don't even have to go there anymore. It's happened so much that it just leaves this impression that it's probably going to happen again. And can I get in touch with my, just think about, is it really going to be that way? And even if I can tell myself objectively that it won't, am I willing to take the chance again, because it's happened so often? And back to your point about, microaggressions and such, these things happen in organizations and with groups of people. And because they don't get discussed between both parties, because it doesn't mean that the other person intended it. I mean, I'm in a group now that a group of men who get together and talk about issues of race. Black men and white men get together and talk about issues of race. And one thing that I tend to share, I don't believe that as a Black person in the United States, not every other white person hates me. That's just not reality. However, there's the however of the lived experience that suggests that that might not be a safe place for me because I'm the only, Black person present or whatever it is. And this can be said about lots of other forms of difference. Because I've experienced it so much, it makes it difficult sometimes to go into those environments and again, be my whole self and that type of thing. And so you're helping me and hopefully helping folks that are listening make this connection that when you're exposed to things that don't seem right, don't seem fair, don't seem right, take away my autonomy, impact my status, that type of thing, that I may have now built up this belief that this isn't a safe environment for me. So, wow.
Well, yeah. And I think that you're pointing to something that I think is pretty important to highlight is I don't know if everybody calls it this, but there's a cognitive model called the ladder of inference. And the ladder of inference says that we all get the same data input coming in, but there are some filters along the way. There's what you notice because, I'm not a very observant person. I was told I'd make a terrible cop because I just don't notice things. I kind of go for big picture and I don't notice details quite so well. And so we all get the same data input, but then we filter it out and we selectively see what we choose to see or what we expect to see. And then from there, we start relying on our assumptions. Our past experience is a very important predictor of what our assumptions are. And if we don't realize those are only assumptions, and if we don't question that, then it takes us all the way up this ladder of inference to where you draw some conclusions and you cement it into a belief. And the next thing you know, you're jumping off into action. And people are like, whoa, where did that come from?
Right.
Well, if you had those same set of assumptions and it turned into that conclusion and that belief and it took you to action, it only makes sense. The place that you interrupt that is in interrupting the assumptions, because yes, you could try to see more of the data in a different way. This is why diversity in workplaces is so important, because the data that we see is based and shaped by how we have grown up, the environment we've been in, sort of our entire persona. Our selective data filtering happens based on our environment and our upbringing and our personality. So where we really can intervene, that may be a little out of our control, but we can get more diversity around us and hear more voices, basically to get a better perspective and a fuller perspective. But where we can really do the work, I think, is in the assumptions. Always questioning the assumptions, even just recognizing I am operating on the assumption. We do this in emergency planning. We list out what our planning assumptions are. One of the planning assumptions are that we will probably not have enough resources to handle a major disaster. That's a planning assumption. And from that, other things cascade, like the need to bring in mutual aid and some of the other things that we do. So if you're not aware of your assumptions, you don't have a chance to offer yourself alternative explanations. This was actually a fun exercise. I did this with a group of fire chiefs once for a crisis leadership retreat. And I had them take a scenario and then just rapid fire, what could they do? What else could they do? What else could they do? To get people out of thinking of only what they normally would do, but now let your brain just generate new ideas. I also use, when I teach an emotional intelligence class, I like to use the example of, you've seen someone driving erratically down the road. And so they're driving fast, they're cutting people off, they're pushing those yellows or running the reds. And so what's the assumption that you're making about that person? And almost universally people go, they're just a jerk, right? Because that's been our experience with a lot of those kinds of drivers. And then I ask people, what else could be true? And so, well, maybe his wife is having a baby, or, maybe someone he loves is in the hospital dying and he's racing to his, dying loved one's bedside. You don't know, actually. So what we do, our emotions come out of the story that we tell ourselves. So whatever the story we tell ourselves is in our head is going to generate the appropriate emotions to go with the story. If you really thought that guy was rushing to be by a dying family member's bedside, you would have compassion and you get out of the way. But if you think he's just being a jerk, you're going to be angry. So again, it's perception, how you are perceiving it. But a lot of that we can control ourselves by the stories that we tell ourselves in our heads.
Hi listeners, Jason here. We hope you're enjoying this latest podcast episode. Now, if you're like Joelle, Alicia and myself and enjoy learning from the best, then the Flourish DX Academy is for you. The Academy includes free e-learning courses on the ISO 45003 standard for psychological health and safety at work, and associated topics such as how to conduct a psychosocial risk assessment and how to create the business case for psych health and safety. All courses feature high-quality videos, downloadable resources, multi-choice questions, and a downloadable training certificate on completion. Take your learning to the next level with all Flourish DX Academy courses included within the Flourish DX mobile app. Select podcast episodes from the Psych Health and Safety podcast and sister podcasts from Canada and the USA are also included. Get started with Flourish DX for free at www.flourishdx.com/get-started. That's www.flourishdx.com/get-started. Now back to this episode.
Wow. Stories we tell ourselves in our heads. So again, think about these social settings where, again, we are in a workplace, we're in a club, we're at in a family, what have you, and conflict erupts because I'm trying to do one thing, you're trying to do something else. And in and of themselves, these two things are they're not wrong, they're not bad, they're not anything. They are simply actions that we are taking, but they start to intersect. And at that intersection, that's where we end up with conflict. And I find that is one of the skills that we all should have spent a lot more time developing when we came into this social group. Because when the conflict comes up, we, again, to your point, we revert back to an assumption about you as a person, the group that you're in, other people like you. The last time this happened, there's all these assumptions. And we tend to pick out the one that has the most impact on us, particularly if we've been traumatized by that one. We'll react to that one.
Right.
Because the last person who used that set of words, who elevated their voice, here's what I remember. We got into a thing, or, we ended up separate, whatever it is. But again, we jump to an assumption as opposed to going, so why am I reacting this way to what that person just said? Does that necessarily mean that they are a threat to me? Why am I believing they're a threat? They're smiling. We're certainly at a distance. They couldn't physically attack me. So why is it I'm feeling this way? And because these are skills that people have not practiced. We've not had, it's get the work done. We got to get this done. We got a meeting. You have a proposal you have to present to the whoever. You got to get this done right away. So we don't give people we don't give them the time to process or the system to be able to process, and you end up in the conflict. So how does this show up when there's a real emergency? What's your thought about so now there actually is, the building's on fire. There's a chemical that's been released. There's a flood coming. I actually believe that it complicates those kinds of decisions because there's all these assumptions about how I should be reacting, how other people should be reacting. And my plan is set up. I don't even know these people. That's the first issue, is that in the public sector, that often those who make decisions about emergencies don't know the communities they're making the decision for. So talk a little bit about, to connect a little bit about of your emergency management background with this whole discussion around how decisions get made. Do they affect, who gets evacuated and who doesn't? Who say more?
Well, so with decision making in an emergency, first of all, there's nothing that can really substitute for experience. I will say that there's a reason that training programs are so long for firefighters, for paramedics, because they need to drill that decision making into the individual, so it becomes second nature. So one of the studies that I followed said that the best predictor of good decision making is having already made good decisions. So basically they're saying the experience factor is huge. So first of all, there's that. The other thing is being able to take the big picture view. And of course, this is not what happens when you're in amygdala hijack. And so I will say that one of the most important things to do is to get yourself out of amygdala hijack, because you cannot make good decisions especially if you are in a novel situation that requires you to have some creativity and innovate something on the fly. that's not going to get done from the amygdala. You need your prefrontal cortex for that. And so part of it is just having people, when they're making decisions, be able to take the big picture view, see what the impact is overall, and to be able to calm the amygdala and get themselves back into their forebrain. So I think I'm going to sidetrack just one thing you mentioned about knowing the community. And I think this one is the important thing, is that emergency managers and first responders all need to know the community that they serve. I'm really proud of the region that I work in. I am in the Puget Sound region, and there has been some really good work done on examining what would happen after a major earthquake with islanding. So there are going to be communities that are cut off because of freeway collapses, because of potentially, levee failures or whatever. So with any kind of a disaster, what would be the islands and pockets of people that would be isolated and have to rely on themselves, or that we're going to have to like airdrop things in, or, put special effort to get to. But then they cross-reference that with looking at where are some of our greatest vulnerabilities. So that cross-referencing is like, where do we have communities that don't have as many resources, communities that have higher percentages of people who are disabled, higher percentages of people who don't understand English. It's not their first language, so they can't understand the safety messages. And so all of that work that's being done in this large, basically an 8-county area, it's really oriented around how do we make sure that we are delivering equity in services, so that we're delivering help to people who need it the most. And that means that the people who don't need as much, they're gonna be able to take care of themselves better because they have more community resources and they can help each other more, where people who have nothing truly need that outside help more. So that's, I think, the macro level is knowing your community, and then making sure that you are approaching it from an equity lens, being able to say who needs it the most, and what can we do to help that happen. And then I think the other thing, though, that has to happen is that getting oneself out of amygdala hijack. And so I did, my master's work was around crisis leadership. I built a curriculum around it, and I've piloted a few things in other little ways. I've got a fun unpolarizing workshop that I've deployed a couple of times. So how you get yourself out of that, first of all, I think that self-awareness piece is really huge. You have to practice and cultivate a habit of self-awareness for the individual. And this does not happen during the emergency. This is the homework that you do ahead of time to get you ready to be able to do this in an emergency. And one of the most powerful things that people can do is learning to recognize and delineate their emotional state. So it's an emotional intelligence capacity, basically. Being able to recognize the emotion you're feeling. And there's a quick trick. If you can recognize the emotion that you're feeling, if you say it out loud, it's super powerful. Moves blood flow from the back, and the amygdala moves it into the prefrontal cortex when you can say the name of the emotion out loud. And it's not enough just to have that inner awareness. It's something about turning it into speech and saying it out loud that makes the difference. The other thing that really helps is being able to have social support. And I think empathy is one of those things that's underrated in emergencies. It is important for people who are working the emergency, particularly people who are in leadership positions during an emergency, to make sure that their people know that they care about them and that they're looking out for them, to make sure they know that they have their best interests at heart, whatever they're asking them to do. There was a study of World War II troops that went back and looked at, there were certain troops that they just had incredibly low rates of what they used to call like combat fatigue or battle fatigue or shell shock. And so what we would know now today as post-traumatic stress disorder, they were noticing that these vets, some of them just really didn't show up for them. And yet they were in excruciatingly horrifying circumstances, the same as all these others. So when they drilled down into it and did interviews, they were like, well, how do you know, like, what do you attribute this to? And when they got to the root cause, it turned out it was my commander cares about me. And that was the most powerful thing for preventing PTSD, long-term mental health consequences for some of those World War II troops. When they had a compassionate, caring commander, even if he could be tough, as long as they knew he cared about them, it was that relational bond that helped them feel. So something about having community and having social support, it means that the environment in which responders are working, the old style of barking orders and being kind of mean to the people, do this, do that. It's not like you have to be soft, but there needs to be a recognition of the human element. Say, hey, how are you holding up? You doing okay? Okay, get out there and go do some more. Good job. They need that. And so I think from a leadership perspective, I think people need to remember that even if you're not on the front lines of first response in an organization, the leader needs to take that tone and set the tone in the organization, especially one which is going through crisis. I think the other thing is the flexibility, cultivating the ability to get out of the box. In the middle of the emergency for decision making, you need to constantly say, what else could we do? That's why I put those fire chiefs through that activity. What else could you do? What else could you do? What else could you do? You need to get your brain in the habit of being able to auto-generate new solutions, even if they seem kind of bizarre, because that's where the innovation, excuse me, and the breakthroughs come from. And so allowing yourself to say, just because I have these assumptions and just because I think it's always been done this way, what else could we do? That is actually something that makes a big difference. And then I think the other thing is, this is also, I think, falls to leaders to help set the tone, is you have to always have hope at the end of it. You've got to believe you're making a difference. So you have to know that what you're doing, or the people that you're saving, or whatever it is, that there's hope that you're going to make a difference. If you're on the other end of it and you're not a responder and you see a terrible situation unfolding, you have to remember that you're going to get through it. You're going to come out on the other side, and you have to have that hope. That optimism is also what carries you through.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So, wow. So what do you, having been in and around the industry for as long as you have, what do you do to stay centered and uh, not have too many amygdala hijack episodes? And because some of it, if you can do it, perhaps others can as well. Because there's, again, just my observation, there are a lot of folks in a lot of industries related to emergencies where they're losing hope. As a matter of fact, in 2021, if I'm not mistaken, the leading cause of death to firefighters and paramedics was not crashing their vehicles, was not heart attacks, it wasn't even cancer, it wasn't even COVID, it was suicide. And again, my not having studied all of those cases in detail, I do believe that the environment of constant vigilance and having to worry about just my own life, and then on top of that, what's going on with other people, that is a psychosocial hazard in and of itself. So, what does Deb do to stay? What does Deb do?
So I have some things that I do, and then I have a suggestion, and this might get a little on the woo-woo side, but I'm going to throw it in there because I think it's teachable. I've been able to teach it to people. I've taught a class in this, so I know it's teachable. But let me tell you first the practical things that I do that I don't think anyone has any question that would help. It's just a matter of doing it. Number one, I have a reflective spiritual practice that I engage in every evening. And so I use that time to sort of debrief my day with myself. And I use that, I take that time to really process what I was experiencing in the day, or if it's been a week, but I use that time every evening to sort of take myself down a notch and to really think through what I experienced. I'm going to be adding in, I actually started it this morning because I've been thinking I need to do something in the mornings as well, to take some time. I had an interesting dream last night, so I'm taking some time in the morning to just sit and contemplate and kind of unpack my dream for myself as a way to just center myself and be in touch with like what was going on in my dream life. And for people who don't remember their dreams, I think it can be just that quiet, reflective time of, what am I looking forward to today? When you set that positive thing for yourself at the beginning of the day, you're going to find something positive in the day. And so I think that's the other thing I'm trying to do better with, starting my day that way as well. But I think that evening debrief for myself is super important. The other thing I have cultivated, I don't have a wide, huge, big roster of who I consider close friends. I have a lot of people who are casual friends, but I have a few very trusted close friends who I can tell anything to. I think that's super important. You need to be able to know that you can talk with someone and be real with someone and be raw with someone, and they can love you and hold you and let you say, you're doing great, just keep going, I'm here for you. And then they can be there when you need them again. So I think that cultivating social networks that help support you is really important. The thing that I said is maybe a little woo-woo is one of the things that people don't realize is that we pick up other people's emotions and their trauma, and we experience it on, I think, a physiological level. And I can't tell you exactly how all of this works, but I can tell you that one of the things that plays in, okay, more brain science here. This is my favorite part. One of the things that plays into this is something, we have these specialized neurons called mirror neurons. And mirror neurons' job is to pick up on subtle cues from the environment. And then what it does is it replicates that in your own brain. So there was an experiment that in some primate research that a researcher it was a hot day, so he went out to go get an ice cream cone. And he came back and he's licking the ice cream cone. And every time he was taking a lick of the ice cream cone, he was watching the monkey's brain light up, as if the monkey's right arm was having some of that ice cream cone or something like that. My memory may be fuzzy on that, but it was the idea that the monkey, who they were actually doing a live brain scan on at the time, was having the same brain experience as the guy licking the ice cream. So the monkey wanted some, basically, but in the monkey's brain, it was happening to them as well. This happens. I know I'm super sensitive to scary movies. I'm super sensitive to sad movies. I mean, I bawl like a baby in a sad movie. I'm super sensitive to that. And I think what happens is those mirror neurons, when you experience or see something, let's say violence, if you witness violence, you experience it in your brain as if it happened to you, because your mirror neurons translated it. So when you see responders who are exposed to all kinds of trauma and horrific things, they are experiencing vicarious trauma. Their brain is registering it as that happened to me or that happened to my family member. And so they are traumatized without necessarily realizing they're being traumatized. So I think one of the things, this is where it gets a little weird. I teach a class on how to manage empathy, because I think of it sort of like, it's like we have this filter around us, and I don't know how to describe it except that this model works for me. And it's like when I am encountering somebody and I want to understand how they're feeling, like when I'm in a coaching engagement, I'm trying to connect with my coaching client. I open up my filters and I let myself feel what I'm getting from them. I do that intentionally and purposely because it's my way of connecting with them so I can understand it, because I can actually feel it. Like if they're feeling sad, I'll actually start to feel sad. And I don't know if you've ever noticed it, but if you're around people who are really angry, you get a little testy. If you're around people who are really sad, you start feeling a little bummed out, right? Well, we're also picking up not just mirror neurons from micro expressions being displayed, but we're also probably getting pheromone signals and chemical signals from the other person. So when you're around a person, you have to realize you're absorbing them like a frog absorbs water. And so I actually consciously think about, okay, I'm letting that in. I feel it, I taste it. And now I'm going to just remember that that's them. This is me. And so I mentally kind of close off a little bit, because I've got the vibe. I understand them on a different level now, but it's in psychology terms, they would refer to this as differentiation, making sure, I do the attunement to connect, but then I have to recognize this is them, this is me. And so being able to tell the difference between that's your sad, I'm feeling it from you, but it's not my sad. And that's where self-awareness practices come in. And that's where that's really important. So I think those kinds of things can be taught. And I'm going to give one little trick that I think is a great tool if anyone is ever in a terrible situation and they're trying to differentiate or detach from it a bit. If you mentally imagine yourself standing on a cliff far, far away from whatever it is that you're witnessing. So mentally and emotionally, you pull yourself back in the scene and then imagine yourself viewing it as if from afar. That mentally removes you from the situation. It gives your brain a little bit of a buffer and you absorb less of what you're witnessing in terms of emotional impact. So anyway, those are some of the tricks and things I like to help people get better at so they can manage emergencies better.
Right. Yeah, I think any of these tips and practices that you've mentioned could be effective. And it's not only in, when an emergency management professional talks about, a disaster, sometimes people think that, that's an earthquake, that's a flood, that very well may be, but these practices can help in situations where two colleagues aren't seeing the completion of a project the same way, where there's a deadline that seems to be unreasonable, where there's a job description that seems to be fuzzy, where again, back to a psychosocial factor that's perceived as some sort of threat to me. Why is it a threat? What is causing me to feel that way? Before I get into acting and behaving in a certain way, is there the ability or the practice, or is there a way to start to process what's going on before it causes me to act in whatever way I think I need to act? But as you said earlier, these are things that we have to practice. And as much as it's important in situations to go fast, it's also important to go slow. It's the ability to do a little bit of both at the same time, is to have deliberate action, but do it in such a way that I can be deliberate about this. A lot of things going on, but I can only address one of them. And to address that thing, just need to slow down a little bit. Think about how I'm feeling. Think about how the other person is feeling. Now, what are we going to do about this, as opposed to flying off the handle and going in another direction? So, we could continue this conversation for another few hours, but so I can perhaps have folks check in next time. If people want to get into more of this kind of dialogue with you. I mean, there's something that they've heard that says, I need to talk to that lady. I need to reach out to Deb, and I need to find out a little bit more. What's the best way to do that?
I think the best way is probably, I have a contact form on my website that will flag it a little higher in my email, because I do get a lot of email. My website is crisisoptimist.com. So just like it sounds, crisis optimist. That's me.
Absolutely. Well, I'm hopeful that there are folks out there who may have, either stumbled across this conversation, or who were looking forward to it, because I think there's a little bit of both, that they will, take the time. I heard someone say this recently. I was in a course recently, and the professor said that, he also does some consulting around, I think around diversity, equity, and inclusion. He was saying that if people aren't going to really commit, a year to 18 months to these kinds of efforts, it says it's probably really not worth the exercise.
Oh, absolutely.
And I'm starting to feel the same way regarding all of these topics around, the identification of psychosocial hazards, and psychological health and safety doesn't happen in a 1 hour webinar. It just doesn't. I mean, it can, stimulate some conversation perhaps, but if you really want to do something about it, it's going to take a commitment over a period of time, because the first conversation is going to be it's going to have to be had between you and you. So it's got to start. I got to have that conversation with. I got to. I got to know a little bit more about myself and how I'm reacting before I try to go out and change the world, or address the world in an emergency, or in just a normal situation. I got to really get in contact with what's going on with me.
Yeah, I think what you're mentioning there is, I presented at the Transformative Learning Conference a few years ago, and one of the interesting things about when you're going to learn something that really is transformative, whether it's individually or as an organization, it happens via implicit learning, not explicit book learning or workshops. It doesn't happen in a short burst like that. It happens by living into it day after day after day, and having it reinforced and cultural norms shifting. So just slamming out a workshop and calling it good because you check the box doesn't actually do anything to change hearts and to connect people. So the work of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, really important that those be done over a period of time. The minimum for implicit learning to occur is 9 months. And I think it's more commonly 18 months, as you were talking about. So it needs time, definitely.
Each time. Well, Deb, thanks so much for sharing. I feel inspired myself. So it's just wonderful to hear your experience and expertise in this area, and I believe that it's going to help those that have been listening. So, if you're watching this episode on the Flourish DX YouTube page, please do like, subscribe, and share this episode with others. Though most folks tune into the podcast as listeners, some do watch. And we certainly appreciate the opportunity to be able to share with you. If this is your first time connecting with the podcast, welcome. I hope that you've heard something that'll bring you back in the future. If you'd like to check out some of our previous episodes, you can go to psychealthandsafetyusa.com. All of our previous episodes are there. If you'd like to be a part of the Psych Health and Safety USA movement, please connect with us on LinkedIn. You can also go to the Flourish DX webpage, and there's lots of great information about this topic. And we certainly appreciate the time that you've taken to join us. And we'll see you next time on the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. Thanks very much.
Tune in each Friday for new episodes of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. If you have a story or know of one that needs to be told, reach out to us on LinkedIn or send an email to David at id2-solutions.com or go to the Flourish DX website at flourishdx.com. We'll see you next time.